The gavel of her father's desperation had fallen, and the sound was the scrape of a cheap wooden chair on a bare floor. Clara Merrick, at 19 years of age, sat on that chair in her father's dusty, airless study, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white stones. "He is a man of means, Clara," Preacher Merrick said, his voice straining for a pastoral calm it no longer possessed. He was not looking at her, but at a stain on his desk, a dark ring left by a whiskey glass. "A significant man in this territory. He has need of a wife. We have need of his generosity." Generosity. That was the word he used for this transaction. For the past 2 years, since her mother had succumbed to the cough that rattled the windows of their small parsonage, her father's sermons had grown thinner, while his debts to the town's less savory merchants had grown thicker. Clara was the last coin in his pocket, and he was spending her. "Mr. Blackwell is older than you," he continued, finally daring a glance at her. Her stillness unnerved him. He had expected tears, hysterics. He saw only a terrifying, quiet emptiness. "He is a man of substance. He will provide for you in a way I can no longer—" "What did he provide for you, Father?" Clara asked. Her voice was low, and it did not tremble. The preacher flinched. The answer was forgiveness of a gambling debt to one man, the silencing of a rumored indiscretion with another, and enough gold to keep the church doors open for another 6 months. The answer was the price of his daughter. "You will be married," he said, rising. The authority returned to his voice, the false thunder of the pulpit. "The arrangement is made." Clara did not fight. To whom would she appeal? The town of Laramie saw her as the preacher's quiet, pretty burden. She was an object of pity, and pity held no power. The humiliation was a precise, methodical affair. She was dressed in borrowed lace, a wedding gown that had belonged to the banker's wife, yellowed and smelling of camphor. The seamstress, Mrs. Gable, pursed her lips as she pinned the waist, her eyes full of a sorrow that was worse than scorn. "Mr. Blackwell is a very wealthy man. Dear," she had murmured, her mouth full of pins. "A vast estate. You will want for nothing." Clara had stood rigid, a doll being prepared for shipment. "Does it have trees, Mrs. Gable?" The question was so strange it made the woman pause. "Trees? Why, I suppose it must. It is the Blackwell Ranch. Child, it has everything." It did not have her father's courage. He did not accompany her. He used the coach fare Cassie and Blackwell had sent as an excuse. "It is for one passenger. Clara, he is a meticulous man. He expects you." He kissed her forehead at the station, his lips dry and hot, his eyes already distant, calculating his own survival. She boarded the stagecoach alone, carrying one small carpet bag with her mother's Bible and 2 plain wool dresses. The borrowed lace was folded in a box on her lap, a mockery of a dowry. The journey north was 2 days of pulverized rock and alkaline dust that coated her tongue and stung her eyes. The other passengers, 2 miners and a fur trapper, spoke in grunts, their gazes sliding over her and away, sensing she was not a woman traveling, but cargo being delivered. When the coach finally stopped, it was not in a town. It was simply a crossroads, marked by a single, wind-scarred post. A buckboard wagon was waiting. The man driving it was old, his face a roadmap of sun-scorched wrinkles. He nodded once, took her bag and the box, and gestured for her to climb up. He did not introduce himself, and he did not speak for the entire hour it took to drive from the main road into the valley. This was not the Wyoming she knew. This was something older, harsher. The land was not flat. It was a series of rolling, brutal hills, cut deep by dry ravines. The wind did not whisper. It screamed, a high, thin sound that felt personal. Then she saw the ranch. Blackwell Ranch did not lie upon the land. It dominated it. It was set in a wide, wind-blown valley, the hills rising up on 3 sides like a fortress wall. There were trees, but they were not the welcoming cottonwoods of the plains. They were dark, dense pines, clustered high on the ridges, leaving the valley floor exposed. And the house, Clara's breath caught. It was not a ranch house. It was a mansion, a two-story wound of dark gray stone, built to withstand a siege. Its windows were tall and narrow, like the eyes of a man squinting against the sun. There was no porch, no swing, no sign of welcome. It was a monument to wealth and silence. As the wagon pulled up, the front door opened. A woman stood there, tall and severe, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to hurt her. She wore a black dress with a crisp white apron. "Miss Merrick," the woman said. It was not a question. Her voice was as cold and flat as the stone walls. "I am Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper. Mr. Blackwell is waiting in his study." There was no celebration, no smiling faces, no welcoming party, just the wagoner, Silas, unloading her things, and Mrs. Finch, who led her into a cavernous, cold foyer. The air inside was still, smelling of beeswax and something metallic, like old ashes. "This way," Mrs. Finch said. She led Clara down a dark-paneled hallway to a set of tall, imposing doors. She knocked once, a sharp rap, and opened the door without waiting for a reply. The study was dim, lined floor to ceiling with books that looked as if they had never been read. A fire smoldered in the hearth, offering little light and less warmth. A man stood by the window, his back to her. He was tall, broader than she had expected. The rumors had said he was nearly twice her age. He looked it, not in years, but in mileage. He turned slowly. This was Cassian Blackwell. He was not an ugly man, but he was a hard one. His face was all angles, carved from the same unforgiving stone as his house. Dark hair, thick but cut short, framed a high forehead. His eyes were the color of the sky before a snowstorm, a pale, flat gray. He wore dark trousers and a clean white shirt, simple clothes that could not hide the power in his shoulders and chest. He was, Clara guessed, perhaps 38 or 39, an eternity away from her 19. He looked at her, his gaze moving from her face, down the borrowed dress, to her worn boots, and back up. It was not a look of desire, or even interest. It was the look of a man assessing livestock. "Miss Merrick," he said. His voice was a low baritone, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. Two other people were in the room, Mrs. Finch, who stood by the door, and the wagoner, Silas, who stood near the desk, his hat clutched in his hands, his eyes fixed on the floor. Cassian Blackwell moved to the desk. He did not invite her to sit. He did not ask about her journey. He picked up a small, worn book. "The magistrate was here this morning," he said. "The papers are signed." He motioned to Silas and Mrs. Finch. "The witnesses are present." Clara realized with a cold shock. This was the wedding. This was the entire ceremony. There was no Bible, no preacher, no vows. He opened a small drawer and took out a simple, heavy ring of plain gold. He held out his hand. Clara numbly untangled her fingers and lifted her left hand. It was shaking. He took it. His grip was dry and calloused, his skin warm against her ice-cold fingers. He slid the ring onto her fourth finger. It was heavy, and a size too large. He held her hand for a moment longer, his thumb brushing the prominent knuckle, his expression unreadable. Then he released her and turned away. "Mrs. Finch," he said, his back once again to Clara. "Show Mrs. Blackwell to her room." He walked out of the study through a different door, one that led deeper into the house. He did not look back. He had not smiled. He had not welcomed her. He had simply branded her. Mrs. Finch's expression did not change. "Come, madam." The word madam felt like a slap. She was led up a wide, curving staircase to the second floor. The hallway was long and lined with closed doors. "This is your room," the housekeeper said, opening the last door on the left. "Mr. Blackwell's chambers are in the east wing. A separate room, a separate wing." Clara felt a rush of dizzying, shameful relief, followed immediately by confusion. What, then, was her purpose here? The room was large, dominated by a heavy four-poster bed. A fire had been lit, and it was the first warmth she had felt since arriving. Her single bag and the box with the dress were at the foot of the bed. "Supper is at 7. Mrs. Finch said from the doorway. "Mr. Blackwell expects punctuality." And then she was gone, the door closing with a quiet, heavy click. Clara stood in the center of the room, the oversized gold ring heavy on her hand. She was Mrs. Blackwell. She was the mistress of this stone fortress, and she had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly alone. The days that followed were a study in silence. Cassian Blackwell, her husband, was a phantom. He was gone before she woke, riding out onto his vast lands. He returned for supper, which they took in a dining hall large enough to host 100, yet occupied by only the two of them. He sat at the head of the long, polished table. She sat to his right, 3 chairs down. The distance felt like a mile. He spoke only when necessary. "The beef is adequate. Mrs. Finch. Silas, the east fence needs mending before the snow." "Do you require anything from town?" "Madam." Clara, startled to be addressed, would just shake her head. "No, thank you." He would nod, and the silence would rush back in, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat and the scrape of his knife on the plate. After he finished, he would place his napkin on the table, nod once to her, and retreat to his study. The door would close. Later, hours later, she would hear his heavy boots on the stairs as he went to his own wing. He did not touch her. He did not look at her. He did not speak her name. She was overwhelmed. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. The house was a labyrinth of cold. Clean rooms that she was free to explore, but she had no desire to. She felt like a ghost, haunting a place where she had never been alive. And then there was the wind. It never stopped. It buffeted the thick glass, a constant, mournful reminder of the emptiness outside. After a week, she dared to go to town with Silas for supplies. She needed thread, and the excuse to be around other human beings was a desperate hunger. The town, Redemption Creek, was small, just a muddy main street and a few dozen wooden buildings. As she stepped into the mercantile, the half-dozen people inside fell silent. The women, gathered by the fabric bolts, turned to look at her. She saw the appraisal in their eyes. She was the new Mrs. Blackwell. She felt their whispers like insects crawling on her skin. She moved to the counter, her face burning, and asked the proprietor for black thread. As she waited, she heard a woman's voice, intentionally loud. "Well, she's prettier than the first one. Softer." Another voice, lower, sharper. "Won't matter. That house eats soft things. You remember Eleanor, pretty as a painted doll." "What did happen to her?" the first woman asked. The sharp voice dropped, but Clara heard it clearly. "Some say she just ran. Took off in the middle of the night. Blackwell never even sent a man to look for her." "I heard different," a man by the stove chimed in, spitting tobacco juice into a cuspidor. "I heard she found out what he really is. I heard she tried to leave, and he buried her under the new barn." Clara's blood went cold. She snatched the thread from the counter, paid with the coin Mrs. Finch had given her, and fled back to the wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw her husband differently that night. The silence at the dinner table was no longer just empty. It was menacing. The way he cut his meat seemed precise, controlled, violent. She tried to be proper. She tried to be respectful. She kept her room immaculate. She offered to help Mrs. Finch in the kitchen, an offer that was coldly, politely refused. "Your place is not here, madam." She had no place. She was a wife in name, a prisoner in fact, and she was married to a man who might be a murderer. A week later, the first real storm of the season hit. It came suddenly, a wall of white that erased the world. The wind howled, a chorus of screaming voices trapped in the chimney. The house grew dark, the stone walls radiating a damp, penetrating chill. Clara came down to dinner wearing her thickest wool dress, but she was already shaking, the cold having settled deep in her bones. Cassian was already at the table. The dining hall was lit by a single candelabra, casting long, leaping shadows, misses. Finch served a stew and then left them, the storm sealing them inside. Clara tried to eat, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. The cold was one thing, the noise was another. The wind sounded like a living thing, a predator scratching at the windows, demanding to be let in. She thought of the whispers, buried under the barn. She thought of her father, warm in his study, his debts paid. She thought of her own 19 years, culminating in this dark, cold room, sitting across from a silent stranger who owned her. A tear slipped from her eye, hot on her cold cheek. She dashed it away, angry. Then another followed, and another. A small, choked sob escaped her throat. She pressed her napkin to her mouth, humiliated. She was failing at this, too. She could not even be a proper, silent wife. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking as quiet. Hopeless tears fell onto the plate. The only sound was the storm and her own small, muffled grief. Then another sound, the scrape of his chair. Clara froze, her eyes squeezed shut. She waited for the yell, for the order to go to her room. She waited for him to dismiss her as a hysterical child. Heavy, measured footsteps on the wooden floor. He was walking toward her. He stopped, not beside her, but behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She held her breath, tensing for a blow or a harsh word. Nothing. Then, a heavy weight settled on her shoulders. She gasped, her eyes flying open. He had taken off his own coat, a heavy woolen ranch coat, and draped it over her. It was impossibly warm. It smelled of leather, clean sweat, horse, and the sharp, cold air of the outside. It was the most vital, living thing she had felt in weeks. It enveloped her, a shield against the cold and the dark. She twisted her head to look up at him. He was standing over her, his face in shadow, but his expression was not angry. It was nothing. It was the same closed, hard mask he always wore. He looked down at her, his gray eyes holding hers for a single, breathless second. Then he turned, his footsteps receding, and left the dining room, leaving her alone with the howling wind and the astonishing, confusing warmth of his coat. She sat there for a long time, the tears drying on her face, her hands clutching the lapels of the coat. It was the first act of kindness she had received since arriving. It was not gentle, it was not verbal. It was a purely practical gesture. She was cold. He gave her his coat, but he had walked away. He had given her his warmth, but would not stay to share it. That single gesture stayed with her. It was a puzzle she could not solve. A man who might be a killer, who bought a wife and ignored her, had covered her shoulders when she cried, despite her fear, or perhaps because of it. She began to watch him. She woke before dawn, creeping to her window that overlooked the stables. She saw him. He emerged from the house as the sky was turning a faint, bruised purple. He walked not to the stables, but to the fence line, his long strides eating up the ground. He just walked, for miles, it seemed, a dark figure against the snow, walking the perimeter of his land as if counting his possessions, or guarding his prison. She saw him in the stables when she dared to venture out, seeking the simple, warm smell of hay and animals. He was with his horse, a massive black stallion that watched her with intelligent, wary eyes. But as Cassian approached, the great beast lowered its head, nudging his shoulder. Clara watched from the shadows as her husband's calloused hand stroked the horse's neck, his voice a low, soothing rumble she could not make out. The tone, however, was unmistakable. It was gentle. It was affection. It was a voice he never used inside the house, and she noticed the mirrors. There was a large, ornate one in the upstairs hallway, a relic of some grander, brighter time. Most people glanced at themselves as they passed. Cassian avoided it. She saw him approach it one afternoon, his eyes inadvertently catching his own reflection. He stopped dead. His entire body went rigid, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped. He looked at the man in the glass with a flash of pure, cold hatred. Then he tore his gaze away and strode down the hall, his boots striking the floor with violent force. He was a man who walked his land at dawn, who spoke to his horse with reverence, and who could not stand the sight of his own face, and he would not touch her. Clara realized it with a jolt. In all the weeks she had been his wife, he had never made contact with her skin, except for the ring. That cold, brief, transactional touch. He kept a physical distance, a buffer of at least 6 feet at all times. If they passed in the hall, he would step aside, flattening himself against the wall to let her pass, his hands fisted at his sides. He was not indifferent to her. He was terrified of her, or terrified of himself. Around her, she sat by her fire, wrapped in his heavy coat which she now kept in her room, and wondered which it was. She looked at the gold band on her finger. She was Mrs. Blackwell, wife to a man of ghosts and silence, a man who gave her his coat but would not give her his name, a man who was, she was beginning to suspect, more broken than he was cruel. The house was a tomb of secrets, and Clara, its newest, quietest inhabitant, had become a ghost hunting other ghosts. Her fear of Cassian had not lessened, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp terror of a girl facing a monster, but a deep, aching curiosity about the man who wore his silence like armor. She found her way to the library, the room he called his study, during the long, empty afternoons when he was miles away. Swallowed by the snow-covered plains, it was the one room that held any sign of life, even if it was just the smell of his tobacco, the ink on his ledgers, and the lingering scent of old leather. She ran her fingers along the spines of books that had not been opened in years, Greek tragedies, histories of empires, treatises on livestock and irrigation. They were the books of a man who had been educated, but who had turned his back on the world of words for the harsh reality of the land. In the bottom drawer of the massive, carved desk, beneath a stack of faded maps of the territory, her fingers brushed against a loose wooden panel. It was the back of the drawer. Curious, she pushed. It gave way, revealing a shallow, dark space behind it. Inside was a single small book, bound in faded blue leather, the cover soft and worn. It was not a ledger. A brittle leather tie held it closed. She eased it open, her heart thumping. The handwriting inside was not Cassian's severe, slashing script. It was elegant, feminine, written in faded brown ink, the property of Elspeth Blackwell, 1871. His sister. Clara had not even known he had a sister. She sat in his great chair, the leather cold against her back, and began to read. At first, the entries were light, the observations of a young woman of privilege. Rode with Cassian to the creek. He is wild, but he is good. He laughs more than father knows. There were descriptions of dances in Laramie, complaints about the wind, and dreams of traveling east. The Cassian in these pages was a stranger, a young man who smiled, who teased his sister, who was full of a restless, bright energy. Clara turned the pages, her fascination growing. The diary spanned 2 years. Then, abruptly, the tone changed. The entries became sparse, the handwriting tight, as if written with a hand gone stiff with cold. November 10th. He is gone. Father will not speak his name. He says Cassian is dead to us. A gap of 3 months. February 4th. He is back, but he is not Cassian. The war has taken my brother. He will not speak of what he saw. He just sits in the study and stares at the fire. There is no light left in him. He frightens me. Clara's breath caught. The war. That explained the scars she had glimpsed on his hands, the rigid way he held himself. She read on, her hands shaking. July 19th. The new man, Mr. Davies, was here again. He follows Cassian, asking for money. Father is furious. He says Davies is a jackal. Cassian paid him. He just paid him to leave. His face was white. He looked like he had seen a ghost. July 20th. I asked Cassian who that man was. He told me to never, ever speak his name again. He said there are things that, once done, can never be undone. He said the debt is his to pay. August 2nd. The terrible night. Father is dead. Davies is dead. Cassian is, God forgive him. Cassian is... The entry stopped. The rest of the page was blank. Clara flipped through the remaining pages. All empty. Elspeth Blackwell had never written in her diary again. Clara closed the book, her mind reeling. A terrible night. A man named Davies. A debt. And her father-in-law. Dead on the same night. She slipped the diary back into its hiding place. The secret a cold weight in her stomach. She now understood the mirrors. The man Cassian hated was not the man he was, but the man he had been. The man from that August night, 14 years ago. Her place in the house felt even more precarious, but the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of answers she was terrified to find. She needed to move, to do something that was not just thinking, not just waiting. She left the study and walked, not to her room, but to the kitchen. The kitchen was the only warm place in the house. A vast, low-ceilinged room dominated by a massive black iron stove. This was the domain of Mrs. Finch and, more terrifyingly, of Martha, the cook. Martha was a broad, unsmiling woman with arms as thick as stovepipes, her gray hair scraped back under a plain cap. She had regarded Clara with open suspicion since her arrival. When Clara entered, Martha was kneading a huge mound of bread dough, slamming it against the floured butcher block with rhythmic, violent thumps. "I want to help," Clara said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous room. Martha didn't look up. "Help? We don't need help. Mrs. Finch and I manage." I am not fragile," Clara insisted, stepping closer. "I know I am not useful, but I can learn. Please, I cannot just sit in that room any longer." Martha stopped, her flour-caked hands on her hips. She looked Clara up and down. "You're the mistress. Mistresses don't need dough. They sit in the parlor and catch a chill. The last mistress, Eleanor, did she help?" Clara asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Martha's face hardened. "The last mistress didn't know a pot from a kettle, and she didn't last the first winter." She turned back to her dough. "There's potatoes in the root cellar. If you've a mind to peel, they're in that crate. Don't waste the flesh." It was a dismissal, but it was also a test. Clara found the crate and a paring knife. She sat on a low stool by the fire and began to peel. Her hands were clumsy, accustomed to needlework, not kitchen work. She cut the peelings too thick, and the knife slipped, nicking her thumb. She winced, but said nothing, just wrapped a rag around it and kept working. She did this every day for a week. She peeled potatoes, scrubbed the heavy iron pots until her arms ached, and learned to stoke the stove. Martha rarely spoke to her, offering only grunts of direction. "Mrs." Finch watched with a neutral, assessing gaze, but did not stop her. The turning point came on a bitter, cold afternoon. Clara was reaching for a pot of boiling water on the stove, her mind elsewhere, thinking of Elspeth's diary. The rag she was using slipped, the heavy pot tilted, splashing scalding water over the back of her hand. Clara hissed, dropping the pot with a clatter, and bit her lip so hard she tasted blood, trying to stifle the scream. Tears sprang to her eyes, blurring the angry red skin. "Fool girl!" Martha snapped. She grabbed Clara's arm, dragged her to the basin, and plunged her hand into the cold pump water. The shock of the cold made Clara gasp. Martha held her there, her grip like a vice. After a long moment, she let go, dried the hand roughly, and turned to a high shelf. She brought down a small tin of dark, pungent salve. Her thick, calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, spread the salve over the blistering skin. "You're handier than the last one, I'll give you that," Martha grunted, her eyes on the burn. "But you've got no sense. This stove is hotter than hell's front door. You watch it." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you, Martha." The cook just grunted again. But the next day, she showed Clara how to properly feed a sourdough starter. The ice had broken. Martha began to talk, not about the Blackwells, but about the land. She taught Clara which herbs to dry, how to tell if a storm was coming by the color of the sky, and how to bank the fire so it would last the night. It was a language of survival, and Clara listened to every word. The thaw between them was slow, but it was real. Clara felt she had one single anchor in this cold, floating house. Then, one night, the anchor was ripped away. Clara was in the kitchen, sharing a cup of hot tea with Martha before bed. The wind was high, and a light snow was falling. Suddenly, the front door of the house burst open, slamming against the interior wall with a sound like a gunshot. Cold air flooded the hall. Mrs. Finch, who had been darning socks in the hall, cried out. Clara and Martha ran from the kitchen. Silas was stumbling through the doorway, half carrying Cassian, who was leaning on him heavily. Cassian was covered in mud and dark, glistening patches of blood. His hat was gone. His face was pale and tight with a pain that stole his breath. "Rustlers!" Silas panted, his own face ashen. "Caught them at the North Ridge. 3 of them. We ran them off, but Mr. Blackwell, he took a fall." His horse stumbled, and one of them, he got him with a knife. "Get him to the study." "Mrs. Finch ordered, her voice sharp with alarm. Silas helped Cassian limp into the room and eased him into the large leather chair by the desk. Cassian slumped, his head falling back, his eyes closed. A long, ragged gash was bleeding profusely through his torn shirt, high on his left forearm. "Martha, hot water, bandages, now!" "Mrs.?" Finch commanded. "I'll get the box," Clara said, her voice surprisingly calm. She ran back to the kitchen, her heart hammering. She grabbed the medical box Martha kept, the same one that held the burn salve. When she returned, Mrs. Finch was trying to cut away the bloody sleeve with trembling hands. "He's bleeding too much." "Mrs. Finch said, her usual severity replaced by rising panic. "Let me," Clara said. She knelt beside the chair. Cassian's eyes snapped open. He glared at her, his gaze foggy with pain. "Get Finch," he growled, his voice a low rasp. "I can do it," Clara said, her own voice steady, though her hands were not. She took the shears from Mrs. Finch and cleanly cut the sleeve away, exposing the wound. It was deep, a wicked slice from a skinning knife, and it was still welling with dark blood. "Press on it," she told Mrs. Finch. "Hard." She uncorked a bottle of whiskey from the box. "This will hurt," she warned him. "Just do it," he hissed through gritted teeth. She poured the liquor directly into the cut. Cassian roared, a raw, animal sound, his entire body going rigid. He gripped the arms of the chair so hard his knuckles turned white, but he did not move. Clara took a deep breath. She had stitched her father's shirts. This was the same, just different. She threaded the curved needle. "Mrs. Finch, hold the light steady. Silas, you may need to hold him." "I won't move," Cassian said, his voice strained. Clara's hands, which had trembled over potato skins, were now perfectly steady. She set the first stitch, pulling the skin together. He did not flinch, but a sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. She worked quickly, her focus narrowing to the needle. The thread, the wound. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Cassian's harsh, controlled breathing and the metallic click of the needle. She tied off the final knot and cut the thread. She packed the wound with salve and began to wrap it tightly with clean bandages. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline leaving her. She finished, her hands resting on his arm for a moment. She looked up. He was watching her. His gray eyes, clear now, were fixed on her face with an intensity that burned. The mask was gone, replaced by raw pain and something else, something she had never seen before. "You have a steady hand," he said, his voice rough. He looked down at the white bandage on his arm, then back to her face. "Thank you, Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it, in his low, rumbling voice, was more intimate than any touch. It was a key turning in a lock. Clara just nodded, unable to speak. She gathered the bloody rags and the suture kit and fled the room, her knees weak. After that night, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The distance between them remained, a vast, empty canyon, but now a thin, trembling rope bridge hung between the two sides. He still sat at the far end of the table, but he watched her. When she passed him in the hall, he no longer flattened himself against the wall. He simply stopped and waited for her to pass, his eyes following her. She realized, with a shock, that he was not protecting her from his cruelty. He was protecting her from his darkness, the darkness Elspeth had written about. He was a man holding a bomb, terrified it would explode if he let anyone get too close. And then the world ended. The sky turned a bruised, greenish yellow, and a storm blew in from the north, a blizzard of such ferocity that it defied description. It was not snow, it was a wall of white ice, driven by a wind that screamed like 1,000 grieving women. For 3 days, the ranch was erased. The windows were caked in ice, plunging the house into a perpetual, frigid twilight. Silas and the hands were trapped in the bunkhouse, the livestock secure in the deep barn. In the great stone house, it was just Cassian, Clara, Mrs. Finch, and Martha. The house, which had felt too large, suddenly became a small, cold prison. Cassian could not ride out. He paced. He prowled the halls like a caged wolf, from his study to the parlor, to the frozen windows, and back again. The forced confinement frayed his nerves. He was a man built of motion and solitude, and he had been robbed of both. Clara, emboldened by the diary and the night she had stitched his arm, felt a new, restless energy. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance. She was his wife. She was trapped with this man and his secrets, and the storm was making her brave. They were forced into proximity. He would be in the parlor, staring into the fire. When she entered to get a book, the silence would stretch, taut and electric. He avoided looking at her, his jaw set, his hands fisted, but she could feel his awareness of her, a pull as physical as gravity. "Where did you grow up, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked at supper on the second night. The wind howled, rattling the heavy plates. He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Mrs. Finch," clearing the plates, froze for a second. "Here," he said finally. "Was this house always so large?" she pressed, her heart hammering. "My father built it," he said. The words were clipped, final. He was closing the door. "For your mother?" He looked at her then, a direct, cold stare. "My mother died when I was born." The third night of the storm was the worst. The house groaned under the assault of the wind. Sometime after midnight, the lamps began to flicker, the oil running low. Mrs. Finch and Martha had long since retired. Clara was in the parlor, unable to sleep. She decided to go to her room. She lit a single candle to navigate the pitch-black halls. The main staircase was a cavern of moving shadows. She placed her foot on the first step. At that exact moment, a ferocious gust of wind hit the front of the house. The heavy front door, which Silas must not have barred properly, rattled in its frame with a sound like an explosion. The gust snaked under the door, rushed up the stairs, and extinguished her candle in an instant. She was plunged into absolute, disorienting blackness. Startled, she missed the next step. Her foot found only air. She pitched forward into the void with a small, terrified cry, her hands flailing for the banister and finding nothing. She was falling. Suddenly, he was there, a blur of motion from the bottom of the stairs, where he had been standing in the shadows, watching her. He moved with a speed that seemed impossible, covering the distance in a single bound, his arms, banded like steel, clamped around her waist. He hauled her back, spinning her around, pulling her hard against his chest. Her back slammed into his solid, warm body. Her head was tucked under his chin, his arm a rigid bar across her stomach, holding her so tightly it knocked the air from her lungs. They stood there, frozen in the dark. The only sounds were the shrieking wind and the frantic, dual hammering of their hearts. Clara could feel his thudding against her spine, a frantic rhythm that matched her own. He did not let go. He held her. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was blowing apart. She could smell the scent of him. Clean soap, wool, and the faint, metallic scent of the gun oil he used. He was breathing hard, his face buried in her hair. She heard him make a low, pained sound. Deep in his chest, it was not a word. It was a groan of pure, unadulterated agony. It lasted for 5 seconds. 10, an eternity of frozen, desperate contact. Then, as if he'd been burned, he shoved her upright. His hands dropped from her waist. He stepped back, a harsh, ragged sound tearing from his throat. Clara stumbled, her hand finally finding the newel post. Her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She could not see him, but she could hear him, breathing in great, gasping gulps in the dark. "Be more careful," he rasped. The voice was choked, unrecognizable. He turned and strode away. His heavy boots echoed down the hall, the sound swallowed by the storm. He left her shaking, her body still imprinted with the iron-hard shape of his, her skin tingling where he had touched her. She did not go to her room. The adrenaline was a fire in her veins, burning away the last of her fear, replacing it with a sharp, piercing anger. She was tired of the shadows. She was tired of the silence. She felt her way along the wall to the parlor, found the matchbox, and lit a lamp. The golden light felt defiant. Holding it high, she followed him. He was in the study, just as she knew he would be. He was standing by the cold, dark hearth, his back to her, his hands braced on the stone mantel. His shoulders were rigid. "Why did you do that?" she demanded. Her voice was loud, ringing in the quiet room, cutting through the howl of the wind. He did not turn. "Do what?" he said, his voice flat. "Stop you from breaking your neck?" "No," she said, walking farther into the room. "Why did you marry me?" The question hung in the air, raw and shivering. "Why bring me here?" she pushed, the words tumbling out. "You don't speak to me. You don't touch me. You sleep in another wing. Am I just another possession? Something you bought to settle my father's debts? A ghost to haunt your ghost house? What am I to you?" He was perfectly still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned. His face, in the lamplight, was a mask of anguish. His gray eyes were not cold. They were burning. He looked like a man on a rack, being torn apart from the inside. The storm rattled the windows, as if trying to get in, to join the one raging inside him. "You think I married you for that?" he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "You think this is about your father?" He let out a short, bitter laugh that had no humor in it. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if held by an invisible chain. "You are not a possession, madam," he said, the word a formality that sounded absurd after he had held her body against his. "Then what am I?" she whispered, tears of pure frustration and confusion stinging her eyes. "Why am I here?" He walked past her to the window, staring out at the white chaos he could not possibly see. He pressed his palm against the icy glass. He turned his head, his profile a sharp, dark cut against the faint light. His voice was low, intense, and vibrated with a terrible, ragged certainty. "I married you," he said, "because no one else should ever own you." His words hung in the silence of the study long after he had left, echoing with the retreating howl of the storm. "Because no one else should ever own you." Clara stood there, the lamp heavy in her hand, her body still humming from the shock of his grip. He had not answered her question. He had redefined her existence. He had not bought her to possess her, but to protect her. From what? From men like her father? From a world that sold 19-year-old girls to settle debts? The blizzard raged for another full day, sealing them in that strained, electric silence. But something had fractured. The cold, smooth ice of their arrangement had been shattered, and jagged edges were exposed. He did not speak of it again. He retreated, his mask of hard indifference sliding back into place. But it no longer fit properly. When he looked at her, his eyes did not just skim over her. They snagged, just for a second, before he forced his gaze away. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm broke. The wind died. The world was muffled in a profound, white silence. And then the melt began. It was the first sound of spring, a frantic dripping from the eaves, the gurgle of water moving under feet of snow. The land, which had been locked and dead, began to breathe. The oppressive gray of the sky broke apart, revealing a blue so bright it hurt the eyes. The valley, which had been a tomb, became a nursery of running streams. Within 2 weeks, the south-facing hills were bare, showing the first impossible, violent green of new grass. The air, once sterile and thin, now smelled of damp, rich earth and thawing pine. The shift in the landscape mirrored the shift in the house. The oppressive, waiting silence was gone. Replaced by the sounds of industry, the ranch hands, freed from the bunkhouse, were a constant, moving presence. The thud of axes, the lowing of cattle, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer. Life was returning. And Cassian changed. He no longer just paced. He was preparing for the thaw. One morning, Clara came down to the dining room to find him not gone, but waiting. He stood by the window, a mug of coffee in his hand. "The ground is soft enough," he said, without turning. "The bay mare is gentle, but she is spirited." Clara paused, her hand on the back of her chair. "Mr. Blackwell?" He turned. "You cannot be a prisoner in this house. Madam, this land it is not gentle. You will learn to navigate it. Silas will bring the mare to the paddock after breakfast." He was not asking. He was telling her. She met him at the paddock, wearing a practical wool skirt and her sturdy boots. The air was cold, but the sun was warm on her face. Silas held the reins of a pretty, nervous-looking bay mare. Cassian was already there, mounted on his own black stallion, a magnificent, terrifying animal that seemed to be barely contained energy. "You've ridden," he stated. "Yes, in Laramie, side saddle." A flicker of something, impatience, perhaps, crossed his face. "Side saddle is for parades. It is useless here. You will ride astride." Clara's face flushed. I do not have the proper attire." "I'm aware," he said. He dismounted, and for a moment she thought he was retrieving a split skirt for her. Instead, he pulled a long knife from a sheath on his belt. He walked over to her. She flinched, her mind flashing to the rumors of the barn. He knelt. Before she could react, he grabbed the hem of her wool skirt. With 3 quick, efficient movements, he sliced the seam, splitting the heavy fabric front and back. "There," he said, standing and sheathing the knife. "Now you do." He had, in effect, created a pair of crude, wide-legged trousers. She was too stunned to be scandalized. He was a man of pure, terrifying practicality. "Silas, give her a hand up." "I can manage," Clara said. Her pride stung. She put her boot in the stirrup, but the mare danced sideways. She tried again, and the mare shied. Cassian let out an impatient sound. He brushed Silas aside. "This is not a parlor game." He put one hand on her waist, the other on her leg, and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. She landed in the saddle with a thump, her divided skirt settling over her legs. His hand had been on her waist. The memory of it, strong and impersonal, burned through her clothes. "Your reins are too slack," he said, his voice hard. "All business. You do not ask a horse, you tell it." For the next hour, he taught her. He was not a gentle teacher. He was demanding, exacting, and critical. "You are leaning. The horse is part of you, not beneath you. Look where you are going, not at the ground. The horse will go where your eyes go. Stop pulling on her mouth. She is not a plow." Clara, frustrated and sore, finally snapped. "I am doing my best." "Your best is not good enough if a bull is charging you," he replied, his voice flat. "Do it again." She did. She rode until her legs ached and her spine was straight, and when she finally executed a clean turn, he just nodded. Once. That single nod was more powerful than any praise she had ever received. The lessons continued. The next day, he took her out of the paddock and onto the land. He was showing her his world, the vast, brutal, beautiful expanse of it. He showed her the canyons where the herds sheltered, the high plains where the grass was sweetest, and the streams that would be dry by July. He was teaching her, she realized, to read the land as he did. He was giving her his knowledge. "The wind always comes from the north," he said, pointing to the ridges. "The trees only grow on the south slope. Remember that. You will not get lost." He taught her about the herd. He showed her how to spot a sick calf, how to read the brands, how to understand the silent, massive movement of 1,000 head of cattle. And one afternoon, he stopped by a stand of aspens. He unstrapped a heavy rifle from his saddle. "You will learn this too," he said. I do not like firearms, Mr. Blackwell. Liking it has nothing to do with it," he said, handing her the heavy rifle. It nearly pulled her arms down. "This land is full of things that want to kill you. Rustlers, wolves, men who think a woman alone is an invitation. You will not be an invitation. You will be a warning." He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to brace the stock against her shoulder so the kick would not break her. He set up a tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. Her first shot went wide, the explosion deafening, the recoil slamming into her shoulder and making her cry out. "Again," he said, his voice unforgiving. She shot again, and again. Her shoulder was a mass of blossoming pain. She was furious, humiliated, and ready to weep. "I cannot hit it. It is too far." "Then you are already dead," he said. "Focus. Clara." He had used her name, not Madam. "Clara." She took a deep breath, the smell of gunpowder sharp in her nose. She closed one eye, lined up the sight, and thought of her father's face. She squeezed the trigger. The ping of the bullet hitting the can was the most satisfying sound she had ever heard. She turned to him, a wild, breathless laugh bubbling up from her chest. It was a raw, rusty sound, a laugh that had not been used in months. Cassian was staring at her. The sound of her laughter had frozen him. He looked stunned, as if she had performed a miracle. A slow, almost imperceptible softening happened around his eyes. He had been looking at a student. He was now looking at a woman. "Your shoulder will be bruised," he said, his voice gruffer than usual. He took the rifle from her. "But you are a good shot." His quiet admiration settled over her, warmer than his coat had been. She realized her fear of him was gone. It had been burned away by gunpowder, replaced by a complex, aching, and deeply curious respect. She was not afraid of this man. She was beginning, terrifyingly, to understand him. The next Sunday, he announced they were going to town. "We need supplies, and you have not left the ranch in months. It is time." "Time for what?" Clara asked, her stomach tightening. "For them to see you," he said. He meant the town. He meant the whispers. He was not going to hide her, or himself, any longer. She wore her best dress, a simple blue wool, Mrs. Finch had even commented, "That is a proper color, madam." When Clara came down, Cassian was waiting. He wore a clean shirt and his good black coat. He looked imposing, a man of wealth and power. He helped her onto the buckboard. This time, his hand on her elbow was not impersonal. It lingered. They rode into Redemption Creek. The town, muddy from the melt, was busy. When Cassian pulled the wagon up to the Mercantile, the street went quiet. People stopped, staring. He was not just Cassian Blackwell, the recluse. He was Cassian Blackwell, with his new, young wife. He helped her down, his hand at her waist, a public, possessive gesture, and they walked, not to the Mercantile, but toward the white spire of the church. Clara's heart hammered. "We are going to church?" "It is Sunday," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They walked in just as the prelude was finishing. Every head turned. The whispers were a physical wind, buffeting her. She saw the same women from the Mercantile, their eyes wide with shock and venom. She felt her face burn, and her feet faltered. Cassian's hand found the small of her back. He did not push her. He just held her, solid, unmovable. He guided her to the front pew, the one reserved for the ranch's founder, his father's pew. They sat. He stared straight ahead at the preacher, his profile as hard and impassive as if it were carved from the rock of his ranch. Clara tried to breathe. She was on display. The replacement wife, the girl bought with her father's debts. After the service, They were trapped. The congregation pressed into the aisle, and everyone wanted a look. They were forced to greet people. A woman stepped in front of them, blocking their path. She was beautiful, dressed in an expensive green silk dress, her blonde hair piled high. She was perhaps Cassian's age, and she looked at him with a familiarity that was both hungry and scornful. "Why, Cassian," the woman said, her voice rich and dripping with insinuation. She completely ignored Clara. "It has been an age since you graced us with your presence. I had heard you were occupied." Cassian's face did not change, but Clara felt his hand on her back grow rigid. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was cold. Not just cold, it was frozen. Miss Amelia Vance smiled, a slow, predatory expression. She finally let her gaze slide to Clara, looking her up and down with open contempt. "And this must be the new arrangement. How lovely. She is so very young. I do hope you find her more durable than the last one." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. It was a direct, vicious attack. Cassian did not raise his voice. He did not move. He simply looked at Amelia Vance, his gray eyes flat and lethal. "Amelia," he said, the single word cutting through the whispers. "You will apologize to my wife." The woman's smile faltered. I beg your pardon. I do not suffer idle gossip, and I do not suffer disrespect to my family. Mrs. Blackwell and I are here for the sermon." He deliberately took Clara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers, a public, undeniable claim. "We will be leaving now." He did not wait for an answer. He simply moved, and the crowd, including a stunned and furious Amelia Vance, parted before him as if he were a force of nature. He led her out into the bright sunshine, helped her onto the wagon, and drove them out of town, all in complete, ringing silence. They did not speak for the entire ride home. Clara sat beside him, her hand still tingling where he had held it. He had defended her. He had called her my wife. He had shamed the most powerful woman in town for her. That night, the house felt different again. It was no longer a prison. It felt small. The tension that had been building for months was a physical thing, a storm waiting to break. He was in his study, as she knew he would be. The door was open. He stood by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was not drinking it. He was just staring into the flames, the muscle in his jaw tight. She walked in. He heard her and turned. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For what you did in town. I suffer no fools." "Clara," he said, his voice rough. "She was not a fool," Clara said, stepping closer. "She was a woman who wanted you, and you chose me." "She knows nothing about me," he said, his gaze fixed on her. "And I?" Clara asked, her heart in her throat. "Do I?" She was standing in front of him now, so close she could feel the heat from his body, see the way the firelight caught the dark, conflicted shadows in his eyes. He did not answer. He just watched her, his breathing shallow. She had been sold. She had been humiliated. She had been terrified. And this man, this broken, silent, violent man, had just given her back her name. She was done waiting. She rose up on her toes, placed her hands flat on the hard wall of his chest, and pressed her mouth to his. For 1 second, he was utterly still, frozen in shock. Then, a low, desperate groan tore from his throat. The glass shattered on the hearthstone. His arms came around her, one hand tangling in her hair, the other clamping at her waist, lifting her, pulling her against him with a force that stole her breath. He kissed her back. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of starvation. It was desperate and angry, and full of a raw, agonizing hunger that had been denied for years. It was the storm that had been trapped inside him, and it broke over her, full of restraint and desperation at once. It was the kiss of a man drowning, and she was his first breath of air. He deepened the kiss, his mouth moving over hers, and she met him, her own fear and loneliness dissolving into a heat she had never known. Then, just as suddenly, he ripped himself away. He set her on her feet, shoving her back, his hands gripping her shoulders. He was shaking, His face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that was far beyond her. "No," he choked out. "I cannot. Cassian," she breathed, reaching for him. "Stop," he commanded, his voice raw. He stumbled back, away from her, until his back hit the desk. He looked at his own hands as if they were weapons. "I will not," he pained. I will hurt you." "You won't," she whispered, moving toward him. "You just did the opposite. You do not understand," he said, his voice cracking. He looked at her, his anguish a physical, open wound. "You do not know what I am, what I have done. I know you are not a murderer," she said quietly. His head snapped up. "What?" "Eleanor, your first wife. You did not bury her under the barn. You let her go." He stared at her as if she had struck him. How do you know that name?" "It does not matter. I know you are not that man." "I am worse," he whispered, his gaze dropping. "I am the man who came back from the war, dead inside. I am the man who brought ruin to this house." He finally looked at her. "My past is not one of respectable grief. Clara, it is violence," he told her. He told her about the war, not the battles, but the killing, the things he did to survive. He told her of coming home to a ruined family, his sister Elspeth a ghost, his father driven mad by debt and shame. He told her of the fight to rebuild the ranch, the men he had to face, the violence it took to carve this empire back from the thieves who had stolen it. And he told her about Eleanor. It was an arrangement, like ours, my father's last attempt to make me human. But I was nothing. I was cold. She was terrified of me, and I did nothing to ease her fear. One night, she was gone. She took a horse and rode south. He paused, his shame a palpable thing in the room. I never searched for her. I was ashamed of what I was, of how little love I had to give. I was ashamed that I was relieved. The confession filled the room, and Clara felt her own secrets rising to meet his. He had shown her his deepest wound. She had to show him hers. "You are not the only one with secrets. Cassian," she said, her voice trembling, but clear. "You are not the only one whose family buried the truth," she told him. She told him about the family friend, a man of wealth and influence in Laramie. She told him about the afternoon in her father's study, when the man had visited, the assault, the violation. "I told my father," she whispered, the memory choking her. "He told me to be silent. He said it would ruin my reputation, that it would ruin him. He buried it, Cassian. He buried me to protect his good name, and then he sold me to you." She looked down at her own hands. "I wondered if that was why you kept me in a separate room. If you knew. If you, too, found me. Broken. Not whole." The silence that followed was absolute. She did not dare look at him. She heard him move. He crossed the space between them. She tensed, expecting him to retreat. Instead, his hand, calloused and shaking, came to rest on hers. He did not grab her. He did not possess. He just held her. His thumb gently stroked the back of her hand. She looked up. He was kneeling. Cassian Blackwell, the richest, most powerful man in the territory, was kneeling on the floor in front of her, his eyes level with hers. The anguish was still there, but it was joined by a fierce, protective fire that burned away all her shame. "You are not broken," he said, his voice thick. "You are whole." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture of such reverence it made her weak. He stood, pulling her gently to her feet. He held her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, the way he had in the church. "And you are mine," he said, his voice a low, rough vow. "If you want to be, if you want to be." His words were a question, a plea, and a release, all in one. Clara looked at the man kneeling before her, this powerful, broken man who saw her as whole, and her answer was not a word. She took his face in her hands, her thumbs tracing the hard, angular lines of his cheekbones. She leaned in, not with the frantic, desperate energy of her first kiss, but with a slow, deliberate certainty. She kissed him, And it was a kiss of acceptance. It was a promise. He did not pull away. He did not fight it. He met her, his mouth softening under hers, and his arms came around her, not in a cage of possession, but in an embrace of homecoming. He lifted her, and she wrapped her legs around his waist, her hands tangling in his hair, deepening the kiss. He carried her from the study, his steps sure and steady, his mouth never leaving hers. He did not take her to her cold, virginal room in the west wing. He carried her across the hall, up the main staircase, and into his own chambers. The east wing was not like the rest of the house. It was not a fortress. It was a refuge. A fire burned high in the hearth, illuminating a room that was stark, masculine, and deeply personal. There was a simple, massive bed, a shelf of worn books, and the lingering scent of his tobacco and soap. He set her down gently, his hands trembling as they cupped her face. He looked at her, his gray eyes raw with a lifetime of pent-up hunger and a profound, agonizing fear. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking. I have been alone for so long. I do not know how to be gentle." "You don't have to be gentle," she whispered back, her own voice shaking. "You just have to be here." Their marriage became real, not in a crash of fire, but in the slow, intense burn of embers finally given air. Their passion was not the easy, frivolous romance of youth. It was the desperate, grateful coupling of two survivors. It was restrained, shaped by the deep, abiding respect they had earned from each other, and sharpened by the hunger they had both denied for so long. He was a man of agonizing control, his hands shaking as he finally unbuttoned her dress, his touch reverent, as if he were handling something priceless that he was terrified of breaking. And she, who had only known violation, learned what it was to be wanted. She learned the difference between a man who takes and a man who is given. He moved with a fierce, tender restraint, his eyes locked on hers, watching her, ensuring every touch was a question, not a demand. And when she finally, shyly, pulled him closer, the last of his control broke. He was a man coming home, a man who had forgotten what warmth felt in a world of ice. They did not sleep. They learned each other's scars, the map of their pasts written on their skin. He traced the faint mark on her temple where her father's ring had once cut her. She laid her head on his chest, her fingers tracing the old, puckered scar from a mini-ball high on his ribs, a relic of the war he would not speak of. The stone house no longer felt cold. It was, at last, a home. They fell into a new rhythm. He no longer left before dawn. He would wake and watch her, the early light tracing the curve of her cheek, and a look of profound, stunned disbelief would cross his face, as if he expected her to be an apparition. She would wake in the circle of his arms, his solid warmth a barrier against the world. They rode out together. They ate their meals side by side at the long table, the empty chairs no longer a symbol of isolation, but simply irrelevant, Mrs. Finch and Martha watched the change with a quiet, stoic approval. The house had a master and a mistress, and the oppressive, ghostly silence was gone, replaced by low conversation, by shared glances, by the occasional, startling sound of Clara's laugh. But as their closeness deepened, so did the mystery of Cassian Blackwell. He had given her his heart, his body, and his name, but he had not given her his whole truth. She had taken to organizing his study, a room he now shared with her, finding a strange comfort in bringing order to his chaotic, purely functional world. The desk, where she had first found Elspeth's diary, was now hers to manage. She found the locked ledger tucked beneath a stack of old, useless invoices. Just as she had found the diary, it was bound in heavy black leather, with a tarnished brass lock. It was not hidden, but it was not open. She found the key on his ring, the one he left on the dresser when he washed. Her hands trembled as she took it. It felt like a betrayal, but he had told her she was whole, that she was his. If they were one, then his secrets were hers. She opened the book. It was not a ranch ledger. This was something different. The first pages were records of land purchases, transactions going back over a decade. He had bought out almost every small homesteader in the valley, but the prices were not just fair, they were exorbitant. He was paying far more than the land was worth. Then she saw the transfers, dates that corresponded. 4 times a year, every year, for 14 years, massive sums of money transferred to a bank in Cheyenne, to a single account. The name on the account was Elias Thorne. It looked like blackmail. It looked like hush money. Clara's blood ran cold. This was the debt Elspeth had written about. This was the secret that kept him a prisoner. This was the source of his wealth, the reason he owned the entire valley. He had not just outcompeted his neighbors, he had bought their silence. She closed the ledger, her mind racing. The war, his father's death, the man named Davies, and this new name, Elias Thorne. She could not let it lie. The silence that had once defined him was now her enemy. She had to know the final truth. She confronted him that night. He was cleaning his rifle by the fire, the metallic snick of the oiled rag the only sound. She placed the locked ledger on the table between them. He froze. His hands went still on the rifle. He looked at the book, then at her face. He did not look angry. He looked resigned, defeated. "The key was on your ring," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I saw the payments, to Elias Thorne." He slowly set the rifle down. He leaned back in his chair, his face carved into hard, bleak lines by the firelight. "So," he said, his voice a low, rough sound. "The jury is in." "I am not your jury, Cassian," she said, kneeling in front of him, just as he had knelt for her. "I am your wife. Tell me the truth, all of it." He looked at her, his eyes full of a pain so deep it was an ocean. "You have read Elspeth's diary." It was a statement, not a question. She nodded. "I read about a man named Davies, and a terrible night." "Elias Thorne is Davies's brother," he said, his voice flat. "Dead. And I'm the man who killed him." The confession landed in the room, and the air grew thick. "Elspeth," he began, his voice cracking. He stopped, cleared his throat, and stared into the fire. "When I came back from the war, I was a feral thing. My father was weak, broken by debt. Davies was his business partner, a man who preyed on the weak. He saw Elspeth, his hands fisted on his knees. She was young, so full of light, and he was like your family friend. He cornered her. He hurt her. My father, like yours, wanted to bury it, for the reputation of the family. He told Elspeth to be silent. He took a ragged breath. I was not my father. I found Davies in the saloon in Laramie. I told him to leave the territory, or I would kill him. He laughed at me. He said he would be back for her, that he enjoyed what she was. That night, he whispered. He came to the ranch, drunk. He was going to Elspeth's room. My father tried to stop him. Davies shot him. Just shot him. In the hall. I heard the shot. I met him on the stairs. He raised his pistol at me. I did not have a pistol. I had my hunting knife, the one I used to teach you to ride. I killed him. Clara, not in a fair fight. I killed him like an animal. And my sister, Elspeth. She saw it. She saw what I was. He closed his eyes. Elias Thorne, his brother, was a man of influence in Cheyenne. He knew what Davies was, but blood is blood. He arrived for the funeral. He knew the truth. He threatened to have me hanged. My sister, Elspeth, was broken. She could not testify. She could not speak at all. So I paid him. I gave him everything we had, and I kept paying him. He extorted me for 14 years. He bled me dry. But the ledger, Clara said, confused. It shows you buying land. It shows wealth. He looked at her, his expression grim. The war taught me one thing. The world respects one thing, power. I made a vow that night. I would never be weak again. I would never let another man threaten my family. I worked, I borrowed. I fought. I built this ranch, piece by piece, buying out every man who might one day be a threat, paying them whatever they asked so I would own the land, so I would own the silence. This ranch," he said, gesturing to the room, "is not a home. It is a fortress, built on blood and guilt and silence." He finally looked at her, his face a mask of self-loathing. "That is who I am. Clara, the man you married, a killer, a man who bought his life with hush money." Clara watched him, her heart aching. She saw not a murderer, but a brother who had protected his sister, a son who had avenged his father, a man who had carried a terrible secret for almost half his life. She moved from her kneeling position and sat on his lap, her arms wrapping around his neck. He went rigid, his body tense, unaccustomed to comfort. "I don't care what you did, Cassian," she said, her voice fierce. "I only care that you tell me the truth. You protected your sister. You did what my father was too weak to do for me. You are not a killer. You are a protector." He shook his head, burying his face in her neck. You do not, you should not. You are the best man I have ever known," she insisted. "I am not a good man," he choked out, his voice muffled against her skin. "I am not. I have never, no one has ever—" He stopped, his shoulders shaking. "I have never been loved without fear. Clara, not once." She pulled his head back, forcing him to look at her. His eyes, his cold, gray eyes, were full of tears. He was breaking, the wall he had built for 14 years crumbling to dust. She kissed him, a fierce, tender kiss, pouring all her acceptance, all her understanding, into it. She kissed his cheeks, his forehead, the tears on his face. "Now you are," she whispered against his lips. "Now you are—" He held on to her, his body finally relaxing. His long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a man finally laying down a burden he had carried for too long. The final secret was out. The last ghost in the house had been faced, but the ghosts of the living were harder to banish. A week later, Silas returned from a supply run in Redemption Creek, his face grim. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. There's someone in town, at the saloon. He's asking for you, saying things." "What things?" Cassian asked, his voice flat. "He's Preacher Merrick, sir, from Laramie." Clara's stomach turned to ice. "My father, he's drunk, madam, begging your pardon," Silas said, glancing at her. "He's telling anyone who will listen that you were stolen, that Mr. Blackwell paid for you, and that he's come to get more." Clara looked at Cassian. His face was granite. He said nothing. He simply walked to the peg by the door, took his hat, and strapped his gun belt to his waist. "You're not going," Clara said, grabbing his arm. "He is in my town, slandering my wife's name. I am going." "Then I'm going with you," she said, her chin high. He looked at her, a long, assessing gaze. He saw the steel in her spine. He nodded. "Get your coat." They rode into town in silence. The air was thick with impending violence. When they reached the main street, they could already hear him. Preacher Merrick was on the boardwalk in front of the saloon, a bottle in his hand, his clothes rumpled, his face blotched and red. He was waving his arms, preaching to a small, curious crowd. "He bought her," Merrick slurred, his voice carrying in the quiet street. Like a prized heifer, the richest man in Wyoming. And he had to buy a wife. He bought my daughter, and he thought he could silence me. "Father!" Clara cried, swinging down from the wagon before it had even stopped. "Stop this! You are drunk!" "Clara!" he cried, his face lighting up with a grotesque, greedy smile. "My child, tell them how he forced you." "He did not force me," Clara said, her voice shaking with rage and shame. You sold me to pay your debts." "Lies!" he roared. He pointed a shaking finger at Cassian, who had walked up to stand beside Clara, his presence a dark, silent thunderhead. "You, Blackwell, you think you own her? You think you own this whole valley? You owe me more. A daughter like that. She is worth more than you paid." The crowd gasped. It was a naked public admission. Cassian moved. He was not fast. He was deliberate. He closed the space in 2 strides. His hands shot out, and he grabbed Preacher Merrick by the collar of his stained shirt. He lifted him, slamming him back against the saloon wall, Merrick's feet dangling a foot off the boardwalk. The bottle shattered on the wood. "Cassian, no!" Clara cried. Merrick gasped, his eyes wide with terror, his hands clawing at Cassian's wrist. Cassian's face was a mask of pure, cold fury. His knuckles were white. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the killing blow. He held him there for 5 seconds. 10. The only sound was Merrick's choked, wet gasps. Then, with a sound of pure disgust, Cassian did not strike him. He dropped him. Preacher Merrick crumpled to the boardwalk, a pathetic, weeping heap. Cassian turned, not to his wife, but to the crowd. He stood over the sobbing man, his shadow falling across him. His voice was not a shout. It was a low, clear pronouncement, and it carried to every corner of the street. "Clara Merrick is no man's property," he said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "She was not bought. She was not sold. She is my wife, and what is mine?" He paused, looking at the stunned, silent faces of the townspeople. He looked at Amelia Vance, who watched from the window of the mercantile, her face pale. "What is mine?" he continued. "I protect, as of this morning, everything under the Blackwell name. The land, the cattle, the house, it all belongs to her." He walked back to Clara, took her arm, and led her to the wagon. He helped her up, his touch gentle, and drove away, leaving the entire town of Redemption Creek and her father in a state of stunned, profound silence. They drove home. Clara could not speak. Her mind was reeling. It all belongs to her. The next morning, she came down to the study. He was waiting for her, a cup of coffee in his hand, which he passed to her. He was calm, the storm of yesterday having passed, leaving a new, clear peace. On the desk, there was a single, folded document, tied with a blue ribbon. "What is this?" she asked. "My wedding gift," he said. "It is late. I did not know, when we married, what you were. I did not know what I was." Her hands trembled as she untied the ribbon. She unfolded the heavy paper. It was a legal deed, drawn up by the magistrate in Cheyenne, filed yesterday morning, before they had even ridden into town. It was a full, legal transfer of ownership. Blackwell Ranch, its holdings, its accounts, its cattle, all of it, transferred to the name of Clara Merrick Blackwell. She looked at him, tears welling in her eyes, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the gesture. He had not just given her his name, he had given her his power. He had made her, in the eyes of the world, his equal, more than his equal. He had made her his fortress. "You were right," he said, his voice rough. "No one else should ever own you, not even me." The townsfolk, who had whispered that she was a purchased, passive girl, who had pitied her, who had expected her to break and vanish, fell silent. The richest man in the territory had given his entire empire to the 19-year-old preacher's daughter. He had not bought her. He had not even chosen her. He had, in the ultimate defiance of power, wealth, and tradition, abdicated to her. The deed was a revolution, but Clara Blackwell had not been made to be a queen. She was a woman built for purpose, and the power Cassian had given her was a tool, not a throne. She now had the means to act on the quiet, fierce needs of the community he had locked himself away from for so long. Her first act as the owner of Blackwell Ranch was not to redecorate the stone house or order new dresses. It was to ride into Redemption Creek, not as a guest, but as a benefactor. She went to the small, dilapidated building at the end of the main street, its windows boarded up, a sign hanging crookedly, the paint faded. School. It had been abandoned for 5 years, ever since the last teacher had given up and fled back east. She used Cassian's money, her money, she had to remind herself, to hire a carpenter. She bought glass for the windows, wood for the broken desks, and a new pot-bellied stove. She rode to Cheyenne herself and returned with a wagon loaded with primers, slates, and chalk. Cassian watched her, his quiet admiration a tangible thing. He did not interfere, but when the wagon of books arrived, he spent an evening unpacking them with her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he ran his thumb over the cover of a Shakespeare volume. "You are building something." "Clara," he said, his voice low, "I am rebuilding." She corrected him gently. "It was here. It was just forgotten." She opened the school on the 1st of May. At first, only 3 children came, the children of a ranch hand who was loyal to Cassian. But Clara did not just wait for students. She went to the small homesteads, the ones Cassian had not bought out. And she spoke to the mothers. And she did not just offer lessons for children. From 2 o'clock until 4, she announced at the Mercantile, posting a notice. "I will offer reading and ciphering for any woman who wishes to learn, no charge." The town was baffled. The whispers started again, but they had a new, grudging quality. This was not the act of a trophy wife. This was the act of a woman with intention. Within a month, her small schoolhouse was full. She had a dozen children in the morning, and nearly 10 women in the afternoon. Women who wanted to read their own Bibles, to understand the bills at the Mercantile, to write to family back east. She had proven she was not a passive girl. She was, as Cassian's gesture had made her, a power in the valley. But power, like a carcass, draws predators. The whispers about Clara's strength were met by whispers about Cassian's weakness. "He's gone soft," men muttered in the saloon. "Clean soft. Lets his wife run his business. Lets her play schoolmarm." Amelia Vance and her friends fanned the flames. "It is pathetic," Amelia was heard to say. "He was always a hard man, a real man. Now she has him on a leash. She's controlling him. Gave her the whole ranch. He must be half mad." The rumor that Cassian Blackwell was no longer the ruthless, dangerous man he had been, that he was tamed, reached Cheyenne, and it reached the ears of Elias Thorne. The blackmail payments had stopped. The day after Clara had confronted him, Cassian had sent a simple, 1-sentence letter to Thorne's bank. No more. For 2 months, there was no response. The silence was heavy, unnatural. Then, they arrived. 4 of them. They rode into Redemption Creek not on ranch horses, but on tall, tired thoroughbreds. They wore city boots and long dusters, and their faces were hard and pale, untouched by the Wyoming sun. They did not speak to anyone. They took rooms at the hotel, and they watched. Silas reported it, his face tight with worry. "They ain't cowboys. Mr. Blackwell, they're different. They asked at the saloon where the new schoolhouse was." Cassian's face went perfectly still. He did not look angry. He looked dead. The man who had knelt by the fire, weeping with relief, was gone. In his place was the man who had survived the war, the man who had killed to protect his sister. "They are Thorne's men," he said, his voice flat. "He is done with extortion. He is here to collect." "What do we do?" Silas asked. "You do nothing," Cassian ordered. "You and the hands, you ride the north pasture. Stay there. This is not a ranch matter. This is my blood, my debt." "Cassian," Clara said, her hand on his arm, "you are not alone in this." "I am," he said, his voice terrible. "I am the one who brought this here. I will be the one to end it." He forbade her from going to the schoolhouse. She argued, her spirit rebelling against his command. But she saw the look in his eyes, a cold, profound terror that was not for himself. It was for her. She agreed, for 1 day, to stay at the ranch. But the next day, a child, the young daughter of the blacksmith, fell and broke her arm. The girl was at the schoolhouse, and her mother had sent for Clara. "I have to go," Clara told Cassian. "I cannot let her sit there in pain. I will take Silas." "No," Cassian said, his voice raw. "It is a trap. It is a child with a broken bone." Clara countered, her own fear making her angry. "I will not live as a prisoner because of your past. I am the mistress of this ranch, and I am the teacher in that school. I will go." He saw her resolve. He could not. He realized. use his power to stop her. He had given it to her. "Take Silas," he finally said, his voice gravel. "And take this." He pushed a small, pearl-handled revolver into her hand, the one he kept in his desk. "Do not hesitate, not for a second." She rode to the schoolhouse, Silas at her side. The town was quiet, too quiet. The 4 men were not visible. She found the girl, her face pale and streaked with tears. Clara, her hands steady, set the bone as best she could and began to bind it. Silas stood guard at the door, his rifle in his hands. She was just finishing the splint when the door burst open. It was not a dramatic, shouted affair. It was brutally fast. One of the men, a tall man with dead, black eyes, simply struck Silas from behind. The old man crumpled without a sound. The other 2 men stepped inside. The children screamed, "Mrs. Blackwell," the tall man said, his voice a smooth, Eastern monotone. "Mr. Thorne sends his regards. He is very disappointed in your husband." Clara stood up, moving in front of the children. Her hand was in her pocket, gripping the small revolver. "Get out of my school," she said, her voice shaking but clear. The man smiled. It was a terrible sight. "We will, and you will come with us. A small insurance policy on your husband's cooperation." He took a step. Clara pulled the revolver. She did not hesitate. She fired. The sound was deafening in the small room. The man roared, not in pain, but in fury, clutching his arm where the bullet had grazed it. He lunged, knocking the gun from her hand. He grabbed her, his hand tangling in her hair, and dragged her out the door. She fought. She kicked and clawed, a wildcat, but he was too strong. He threw her over his saddle, and in a cloud of dust and the sound of her own screaming, they were gone. One of the older children, a boy of 10, ran. He untied Silas's horse and rode, sobbing. For the Blackwell ranch, he found Cassian in the stables. The boy fell from the horse, gasping out the story. Cassian Blackwell did not speak. He did not curse. He simply turned, his face a white, terrifying mask of stone. He saddled his black stallion. He checked his rifle, his revolver, and slid his long hunting knife into the sheath on his belt. The ranch hands, hearing the cry, ran from the bunkhouse, rifles in hand. "Mr. Blackwell, where are they? We'll ride with you." "No," Cassian said, his voice a low, empty sound from a tomb. "This is not a fight. This is a sacrifice. They took her to trade for me. Stay here. Protect the ranch. Protect what is hers." He rode out alone, not in a frantic gallop, but at a steady, relentless pace. He was not riding to a rescue. He was riding to an execution. His own. He knew where they would be. An old, abandoned line shack in the canyons to the east. A place known for being indefensible. A place where deals were made. A trap. He saw the smoke from their fire. He rode into the small clearing, his hands raised, palms open. His rifle was in its scabbard. The tall man stepped out of the shack, his arm in a bloody sling. His smile was triumphant. "Blackwell," he spat. "We knew you would come. A soft man, just like they said. Drop the gun belt." Cassian unbuckled his belt and let it fall to the dust. "Now," the man said. "A trade. Your life for hers. Mr. Thorne wants restitution. He wants the man who killed his brother." "I'm here," Cassian said. "Let her go." "Oh, we will," the man said. 2 others emerged, dragging Clara. She was gagged, her hands tied, her face pale but her eyes blazing with fury. "First," the leader said, "we deliver the message." He nodded to his men. They fell on Cassian. He did not fight back. He stood, a stone monolith, and let them beat him. They drove him to his knees, their fists and boots thudding into his ribs. His face, Clara screamed against her gag. They beat him until he was a gasping, bloody ruin. Then they dragged him into the shack and tied him to a heavy wooden chair, opposite Clara. "Mr. Thorne will be very pleased," the leader said. He touched his bleeding arm. "This one, she has spirit. He might enjoy breaking her, After you're dead." He laughed. "We'll wait for dark. Then we've finished this." He left, leaving one man to guard them. A young, nervous-looking man who held a rifle pointed at Cassian's chest. Night fell. The shack was lit by a single, guttering lantern. Cassian was barely conscious, his head hanging, his breathing shallow and wet. Clara's heart was breaking. This was his guilt. He had come here to die for it. The guard sat on a stool by the door, occasionally taking a pull from a flask. The other men were outside, their voices low as they drank by the fire. Clara had been working on her rope since the moment they tied her. They had been careless, underestimating her. The rope was old, and she was relentless, sawing her wrists back and forth against the rough-hewn chair. She felt the fibers give. Then, her hands were free. She did not move. She waited. The guard, bored and emboldened by the whiskey, stood and walked over to her. "You're the one," he sneered. "The one he gave it all to. What's so special about you?" He reached out a hand to touch her face. Clara moved. She exploded from the chair, her shoulder driving into his stomach, slamming him back against the wall. The rifle clattered to the floor. He grunted, surprised, and she grabbed the first thing she could find, the heavy, cast-iron skillet left by the cold fire pit. She swung it with all her strength. The sound of it connecting with his head was a sickening, dull thud. He collapsed, unconscious. She did not pause. She grabbed the man's knife from his belt and ran to Cassian. "Cassian!" she whispered, frantically cutting the ropes that bound his hands and feet. His head came up, his one good eye focusing on her with a desperate, stunned hope. "Clara, can you ride?" she whispered. "I can." He growled, the words thick with blood. He grabbed the fallen guard's rifle. She took the man's revolver. "The horses," he panted, pulling himself up. They slipped out the back of the shack. The horses were tied 20 yards away. The men by the fire were loud, drunk and unaware. They crept, yard by yard. They were almost there. A twig snapped under Cassian's boot. "What was that?" a voice called from the fire. One of the men stood, a dark silhouette against the flames. He saw them. He yelled, "Run!" Cassian roared. He shoved Clara toward his stallion. "The fastest horse! Get on! Ride!" "Not without you!" she cried, grabbing the reins of the second horse. A shot rang out, the bullet whining past her ear. Cassian returned fire, the rifle roaring, driving the men back to cover. He scrambled onto his own horse, just as Clara mounted hers. "Ride for the high rocks!" he yelled, and they plunged into the moonlit chaos of the canyons. They were chased. They rode for their lives, the sound of hoofbeats and gunshots echoing off the canyon walls. They were 2, and the men behind them were 3. They pushed the horses, their lungs burning, the moonlight a cold, pale searchlight that offered no cover. A bullet struck the rock beside Clara's head, sending chips of stone into her face. "This way!" Cassian yelled, veering into a narrow, dark ravine. It was a box canyon, a dead end. They were trapped. They dismounted, pulling the heaving horses behind a jumble of boulders. Cassian pushed Clara down, his own body shaking, not from fear, but from the beating. "Stay down!" he commanded. The sound of the approaching horses. They were slowing down, knowing they had them cornered. "Blackwell," the leader's voice echoed. "You're done. Give up the girl. We might let you live." Cassian checked the rifle. 2 shots left. He had the revolver, with 5. He handed it to Clara. "If I fall," he said, his voice ragged, "do not let them take you." She understood. Her hand closed over the gun. "We," she said, "will not fall." 2 of the men, overconfident, rode into the narrow ravine. They were dark shapes against the bright, moonlit entrance. Cassian rose from the rocks. He was not the man who had knelt, broken, in the study. He was not the man who had let them beat him. He was the man who had survived the war. He fired. The rifle shot was an explosion. One of the riders cried out and fell from his horse. The second man, startled, fired wildly. Cassian fired again. The second man slumped over his saddle, his horse bolting. It was over in 2 seconds. Quick, brutal, silent. The third man, the leader, yelled from the canyon entrance, but he did not come in. He fired 2 shots into the darkness. Then they heard him, his horse galloping away, retreating. He was one man, and he did not know what was waiting in the shadows. Silence, profound and heavy, fell on the ravine, broken only by the groans of the dying man. Clara stood up, her entire body shaking. Cassian did not move. He stood, the rifle still pointed, his body rigid. Then, a long, shuddering tremor went through him. The rifle slipped from his fingers, clattering on the rocks. He leaned against the canyon wall, his head bowed, and he was sick, his body convulsing as he retched onto the stones. The act of killing, the thing he had held at bay for 14 years, had broken him. The guilt was a poison, and it was pouring out of him. Clara went to him. She did not recoil from the violence, from the bodies on the canyon floor. She put her arms around him, holding his shaking, beaten body. He turned, burying his bloody face in her neck, his arms clamping around her, holding her as he had on the stairs, as if she were the only thing keeping him from falling into an abyss. "It's over," she whispered, her own tears hot on his cold skin. "It's over, Cassian. I am safe. You are safe." They rode back at dawn, 2 exhausted, bloodied figures on 2 tired horses. When they crested the ridge and saw the ranch house, Silas and the hands rode out to meet them, a whoop of joy rising from the men. The sheriff was there. He had been alerted by the gunfire in the hills. Cassian, his face swollen and bruised, but his voice clear, dismounted and walked to the lawman. Clara stood at his side, her hand in his, and he told him. He told him everything. The death of Davies, the blackmail, Elias Thorne, the kidnapping, the self-defense in the canyon. The sheriff listened, his gaze moving from Cassian's beaten face to Clara's defiant, steady one. He looked at the deed in Cassian's hand, which Cassian had pulled from his pocket, the one proving Clara owned the ranch. This was not a drifter. This was the most powerful woman in the territory. "I will send a wire to the marshals in Cheyenne," the sheriff said, his voice final. "Elias Thorne has a great deal to answer for. As for the men in the ravine, it sounds to me like self-defense." The long shadow of the past, the blackmail that had fueled Cassian's isolation, was finally exposed to the light. That night, in their room, Clara tended his wounds. She stitched a cut over his eye, her hands as steady as they had been when she sutured his arm. He was silent, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the fire. She finished. She put the supplies away and came to him. He was clean, but he looked broken in a way the beating had not been able to accomplish. He was ashamed. He slid from the chair, his body aching, and knelt before her. He did not, or could not, look at her face. He took her hand, his head bowed. He asked, his voice a raw, broken whisper, "To stay, after this, after what I am, after the men I showed you the worst of me, Clara, the animal I have kept caged." He was not asking for forgiveness for the killing. He was asking for permission to exist, to be the man he was, and still be loved. Clara sank to her knees in front of him, her hands coming up to cup his bruised, battered face. She forced him to look at her. "I never wanted the best man, Cassian," she said, her voice thick with a love that was as fierce and unyielding as the land itself. "I wanted the true one." She pulled him to her, and she kissed him, sealing the final, broken in 2 pieces of his soul together with her own. The scars on Cassian's face and ribs healed, fading from angry welts to pale, silver lines. The wounds inside him, the ones carved by 14 years of guilt and isolation, took longer. They did not disappear, but they were no longer open. Clara's love had not erased his past, but it had drawn the poison out, leaving only the mark, a story of survival rather than a sentence of damnation. The ranch, under Clara's hand, did not just prosper, it flourished. It came alive. She had an instinct for life, a quiet, nurturing pull that the dry, masculine land had craved. She convinced Cassian to plant a vast vegetable garden near the house, a project Martha embraced with a fierce, crackling energy. The stone fortress, once smelling only of beeswax and old ashes, was now filled with the scent of baking bread, drying herbs, and the brightness of the cut wildflowers Clara insisted on placing in the study. She directed the ranch's finances with a keen, practical mind. She saw that the hands were paid a better wage, and she established a line of credit at the mercantile for their wives, tied directly to the ranch account. She was not just a mistress, she was an employer, and a fair one. The loyalty Cassian had commanded through fear and respect, Clara earned through generosity and compassion. Her true work, however, was not in the ledgers. It was in the small, ink-stained journal she now kept. She had found her voice, not just in speaking, but in writing. She began by documenting her own story, the raw, terrifying journey from her father's parsonage to this wild, open valley. But soon, her focus shifted. When the women came to her schoolhouse for their afternoon lessons, they began to talk. They told her their own stories, whispering them over slates and primers, stories of crossing the plains, of children lost to fever, of husbands who drank, and of small, profound joys. Clara listened, and with their permission, she wrote them down. She became the chronicler of Redemption Creek, the keeper of the women's histories, the ones that were never spoken aloud in the saloon or the church. She was giving a voice to the silent, just as Cassian had given a voice to her. Cassian, healed but forever marked, watched her with a quiet, profound awe. He had built an empire to keep the world out, and his wife had, in less than a year, invited the world in, and he found, to his astonishment, that he was not afraid. He let her take the lead. He had given her his power, and he honored the gift. When men from other ranches came to talk cattle, he would sit at the table with them, but he would say, "You will have to speak to Mrs. Blackwell about the price. The decision is hers." The first time he did it, the men had sputtered, looking at Clara as if she were a parlor trick. But Clara, her face calm, would look at the numbers and say, "Your offer is too low for this time of year. We will hold the herd for another 2 weeks. The price is firm." They learned, very quickly, that she was not her husband's puppet. She was his partner. The town, which had once been silent or cruel, began to respect her. They no longer saw the pale, frightened girl who had arrived on the stagecoach. They saw the woman who had faced down Elias Thorne's men, the woman who had reopened the school, the woman who now owned the largest ranch in the territory and used that power not to intimidate, but to build. The shadows of Cassian's past retreated, dissolving in the new, bright light Clara brought. The federal marshals in Cheyenne, armed with Cassian's full confession and the testimony of the sheriff, had moved on Elias Thorne. The man's empire of blackmail and intimidation crumbled. He was arrested, his name disgraced, and the long, bleeding debt that had defined Cassian's life was finally, legally, paid. As for his other enemies, they either left or lost their power. Amelia Vance, her public shaming at Cassian's hand having broken her social standing, sold her father's mercantile and moved to San Francisco. The whispers she had once commanded had turned against her. The town of Redemption Creek had a new matriarch, and it was not a woman of spite and silk, but one of courage and wool. The ones who stayed, the men and women who had gossiped, now offered Clara polite, respectful nods, or simply the distance of their own shame. Time moved, the land turned, the green of spring deepened into the hot, golden haze of summer, which in turn gave way to the sharp, crisp blue of autumn. The first anniversary of her arrival, the day of their cold, silent wedding, was approaching. Clara was in their room, the room in the east wing that was now hers as much as his, folding laundry. She opened her old Pine Hope chest, the one she had brought from Laramie, to store the clean linens. Her hand brushed against something beneath the false bottom, a space she had forgotten existed. She pulled it out. It was a letter, a single envelope, made of thick, expensive paper. It was addressed simply to her. The handwriting was Cassian's. Her heart stopped. She sat on the floor, the scent of lavender and clean cotton around her, and she broke the wax seal. The date at the top of the page was one day before her arrival, the night before their wedding. He had written, "To the woman who comes tomorrow, I do not know your name. I know only that you are 19, and that you are the daughter of a desperate man. For this, I am already sorry. The sin of your father is not your own, yet you are the one paying for it. I am implicated in that sin by my acceptance of this arrangement. I have my reasons, though they will be no comfort to you. You will arrive at a house that is not a home. You will be wed to a man who is not a husband. I am a shell. The man I was is dead, and the thing that walks in his place is not fit for a woman, especially not one of public respect. You will be given your own room. You will not be touched. You will not be burdened by me. I am a man with ghosts, and they are violent. I will not add you to their number. I have seen what happens to soft things in this house. I will not have your ruin on my conscience, to join the others. My sin is that I am using you. I am using this marriage as a shield. The world demands a man have a wife, have a life, and I have neither. But my true reason is this. I saw you once. 2 years ago, in Laramie. You were with your mother, buying ribbon. You smiled. And you did not know that the men on the boardwalk had stopped to watch you. You were full of a light I thought had been extinguished from the world. When your father, in his disgrace, offered you to me, I said yes. Not to own you, but because I could not bear the thought of any other man, any man like him, or like me, putting out that light. This is my vow to you, not one of love, for I have none to give, but one of protection. You will be safe here, even from me. I have given my lawyers instructions. This paper you hold is a promise. On your 21st birthday, or any day thereafter you choose, you will be given a full and legal divorce, and with it, a sum of $10,000, enough to take you anywhere in the world you wish to go, to start a life free from your father and free from me. You are not my wife. You are a guest I am protecting. I am sorry for the coldness you will find here. It is the only kindness I know how to show. See, Clara wept. She sat on the floor and cried, not with sadness, but with a profound, aching wave of love. The coldness, the separate rooms, the silence. It had not been rejection. It had been a sacrifice. It had been his agonizing, broken attempt to protect her, to give her the freedom he had never had. The $10,000, his planned wedding gift, had been eclipsed by the reality of what he had given her instead. His entire world, his heart, his name. He found her there, the letter clutched in her hand, her shoulders shaking. He saw the paper and his face went pale. Clara, that was written by a man who did not know you. A fool. She stood, and she threw her arms around him, pressing her face into his chest. No, she whispered. It was written by the truest man I have ever known. On the day of their anniversary, the sky was a pale, clear blue, the air holding the last warmth of autumn. They did not celebrate with wine or gifts. They rode up to the high ridge, the one that overlooked the entire valley, the one where he had taught her to read the wind. From here, they could see everything. The stone house, no longer a fortress, but a home. The new, green patch of the garden. The small, neat roof of the schoolhouse in the distance. The vast, rolling herds of cattle. They had brought 2 things, a shovel and a small sapling, a cottonwood, wrapped in burlap. They dug a hole in the rich, dark earth, side by side. Cassian's hands, sure and strong. Clara's, smaller, but just as determined. "What are we burying?" Cassian asked, his voice low. Clara reached into her pocket. She pulled out 2 things, the small, worn blue diary of Elspeth Blackwell, and the black, locked ledger. She dropped them into the hole. They were stories of the past, of guilt, and of silence. "The debt," Clara said, "and the silence." Cassian understood. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out the letter he had written, the one she had just found. He added it to the whole, a promise of freedom. now replaced by a bond of love. They planted the tree on top of them. They packed the earth around its slender trunk, their hands touching in the soil. It was a small, hopeful, living thing, a promise of a future rooted in the very past they were laying to rest. They stood, side by side, looking out at the valley, their valley. "It is a good life, Clara," Cassian said, his voice thick. "You have given me a life. It is more than I ever expected to have, but it is not. It is not all a woman wants." He turned to her, taking her hands. "If you want children," he said, his voice rough with vulnerability, "we will have them. I will give you a family, a real one." Clara smiled, a slow, gentle smile that lit her entire face. She reached up, resting her forehead against his, her eyes closing as she felt the steady, solid presence of him. "We already are one," she whispered. That evening, a pale crescent moon rose over the sharp, dark silhouette of the hills. The wind, which had once been a scream of isolation, was now just a soft, breathing sound in the pines. Clara came out onto the terrace. Cassian was there, leaning against the stone balustrade, watching the night. He turned as she approached, and a small, rare smile touched his lips. He held out his hand. She took it. He pulled her close, his arm settling around her waist. There was no music. There was no orchestra, no parlor piano. There was only the vast, deep silence of Wyoming, the sigh of the wind, and the sound of their own heartbeats, a steady counter-rhythm that had finally found its harmony. He began to move, a slow, simple step, and she moved with him. They danced, there on the stone terrace, under a pale sky, outside the mansion that was no longer a fortress. He, the silent, millionaire cowboy, his face no longer a mask of hardness, but one of profound, quiet peace. And she, the preacher's daughter, no longer a piece of property, but the woman who owned his heart. And when people in Redemption Creek spoke of them, they no longer whispered. The pity was gone. The envy had faded. They spoke of it as a fact, as solid as the mountains themselves. They said the richest man in Wyoming, a man haunted by blood and war, had given his entire empire away, and in return, he had gotten something more valuable than gold, land, or all the cattle in the territory. He had, they said, gotten his soul back. Thank you for listening to this story. We truly hope you enjoyed this journey into the American West. We would love to know where you are listening from, so please drop a comment and say hello. Be sure to subscribe to From Wild West for more stories like this one. And let us know your thoughts on Clara and Cassian's story. We read every comment. Thank you again, and we will see you next time.